Berlin, April 1945. A young German soldier crouches behind a shattered brick wall. Soviet troops are less than 20 meters away, moving from doorway to doorway. Does not lift his head, he does not aim, he does not even show his face. Instead, he slides a strange, twisted piece of steel over the edge of the wall. It glances into a tiny mirror and squeezes the trigger. Bullets fly out sideways. 2 Soviet soldiers drop. He never once showed himself to the enemy. The rifle in his hands did something no rifle was ever supposed to do. It shot around a corner. Welcome back to WW2 Hero Cipher. Today we are opening the file on one of the strangest weapons ever built by the Third Reich. A gun that broke every rule of physics. Your school teacher ever told you? A gun that American troops laughed at when they first saw it, then quietly shipped back home to study in secret. A gun so bizarre that when soldiers on the battlefield first heard about it, most refused to believe it was real. This is the story of the Krummlauf, the bent barrel rifle. And by the end of this video you will understand why it was mocked, why it was buried by history, why modern armies quietly copied its ideas 60 years later. Now before we go any further, let me tell you exactly what the Krummlauf actually was, because this is where most people get confused. Krummlauf, which is German for curved barrel, was a bent barrel attachment for the Sturmgewehr 44 rifle developed by Germany in World War II, and the curved barrel included a periscope sighting device for shooting around corners from a safe position. Read that again slowly. A bent barrel. On purpose. Not damaged, not accidental. Bent by design. The German army looked at the straight rifle barrel, a design that had worked for centuries, and said, "No, we want it to curve. We want the bullet to change direction after leaving the chamber." And astonishingly, they built it, they tested it, put it in the hands of real soldiers, and they fired it in real combat. Now, if you have ever watched the film Wanted, where Angelina Jolie curves bullets in the air, you probably rolled your eyes. Bullets do not just bend. Physics does not work that way. The Krummlauf did not bend the bullet in midair. It bent the barrel itself. The bullet still traveled in a straight line, but the line it traveled came out at an angle to the shooter's shoulder. And this small, strange idea was born from something very dark and very desperate. Because to understand why any sane engineer would sit down and design a rifle that fires sideways, you have to understand what German soldiers were facing in the winter of 1943 and 1944. The war on the Eastern Front had turned into a nightmare of house-to-house fighting. Soviet soldiers were slipping through the rubble of destroyed cities, climbing onto German tanks and dropping grenades straight into the crew compartments. German tank crews were being burned alive inside their own vehicles because they could not see, could not shoot at. The infantry crawling all over them. Something had to change. Someone had to invent a way for a soldier to fire at an enemy he could not directly see. And that someone, or rather that team of someones, worked at a company called Rheinmetallborsig. Now here's where the story gets really interesting. I want you to stay with me because in the next section we are going to walk into the actual laboratory where this weapon was born. We are going to meet the engineers who thought they could rewrite the rules of gunfire. We are going to see the very first prototype, the one that exploded on the test range. And we are going to find out how a rifle everyone laughed at almost changed the entire face of urban warfare. But before we get there, let me leave you with one detail that still gives me chills. It is estimated that approximately 20,000 units were ordered in total, with only approximately 500 ever delivered, with almost no examples being encountered on the collector's market today. 20,000 ordered, 500 delivered. That means somewhere out there, buried in the ruins of a factory, or lost in the archives of a defeated army, thousands of these bent-barreled rifles simply vanished. Some historians believe they were destroyed by the Germans themselves before the Allies could capture them. Others believe they were quietly taken away by Soviet intelligence and studied for decades. Nobody knows for sure. And that mystery is part of why the Krummlauf still fascinates weapon historians today. What we do know is this. The rifle it was attached to, the Sturmgewehr 44, was itself one of the most important weapons of the entire 20th century. Developed in Nazi Germany and fielded in 1943 to 1945, the StG-44 was the world's first mass-produced assault rifle. Combining the firepower of a submachine gun with the range and accuracy of a rifle in a select fire package, and it chambered the intermediate 7.92 by 33 mm Kurz cartridge, a revolutionary step that set the foundation for post-war designs like the AK-47 and M16. So think about that for a moment. The rifle you saw earlier in this video, the one with the twisted, curved barrel sticking out of it, was based on the direct ancestor of the AK-47. This was not some primitive musket. This was cutting-edge 1940s technology, and someone still thought bending its barrel was a good idea. So what made a group of highly trained German engineers convinced that this insane idea would actually work? What did they see coming that the rest of the world missed? And why did the man in charge of German weapons research personally push this project forward, even when other officers called it a waste of steel? Stay right here, because the next part of this story will completely change the way you look at the final years of World War II. Now stop for a moment. If you are still with me, drop a comment below with the word curved so I know you are here. Because what I am about to tell you next is the part of this story that most YouTube channels get completely wrong. And you deserve the real version straight from the actual German archives and the intelligence reports written by the American officers who examined these rifles after the war. Let us go back to 1942. Before the Krummlauf was even a rifle attachment, it was a strange curiosity in a testing laboratory. The earliest documented research in the use of curved barrels began in 1942, primarily for use in proof-firing heavy anti-aircraft machine guns at short ranges. That is right. The very first bent barrels were not weapons at all. They were testing tools. German engineers wanted to fire anti-aircraft rounds inside a small building without the bullets flying out and hitting somebody, so they built curved barrels to send the bullets in a safe direction. Nobody was thinking about shooting around corners yet. Nobody was thinking about combat. It was just a laboratory tool. But then something happened. Somebody, we are not entirely sure who, looked at that curved test barrel and asked a simple question. If we can bend a bullet's path safely in a laboratory, why can't we bend it on a battlefield? Why can't a soldier fire from behind a wall? Why can't a tank crewman shoot straight down the side of his own vehicle? And with that one question, the Krummlauf project was born. This later progressed to use with the K98 rifle, which eventually piqued the interest of the German armored corps for use against dismounted infantry in and around tanks and armored vehicles. The Armored Corps was the first group to actually beg for this weapon, where tanks were being torn apart in the streets of Stalingrad and Kharkov. They needed something, anything, and a rifle that could shoot at the men climbing onto their turrets sounded like a miracle. The job of building this miracle went to one of Germany's oldest and most trusted weapons manufacturers, Metallborsig. Development was initiated in late 1943 by engineers at Rheinmetallborsig, including Colonel Hans Schede, under the auspices of Albert Speer's research division, with early testing involving Mauser rifles. And initial prototypes tested a 20mm curved barrel attached to an 8mm rifle, followed by trials on the Mauser K98K with a 15-degree bend using 7.92 by 57mm ammunition, which proved unsatisfactory and led to refinements for a 30-degree curve. Now, Albert Speer was not just any bureaucrat. He was Hitler's personal architect turned Minister of Armaments. Speer had the authority to fast-track any weapon he believed in. For reasons that historians still debate today, he believed in this one. The early tests were, to put it politely, a disaster. The first prototypes used a larger diameter curved tube attached to a smaller diameter rifle barrel. The idea was that the bullet would enter the curve, bounce around, and come out at a new angle. It worked, sort of, but the bullets came out unstable, tumbling through the air. Accuracy was terrible. Barrels wore out after just a few shots. Some prototypes literally split open on the firing range. Any normal weapons program would have been shut down at this point. But the German army was not in a normal situation. By late 1943, they were losing the war. They were desperate for wonder weapons. They were desperate for anything that could give their soldiers an edge in the brutal urban fighting that was about to reach their own cities. And so the Krummlauf project was not canceled. It was doubled down on. The engineers were told to keep trying. Try tighter curves. Try softer bullets. Try different steel. Try venting the barrel to release the extra gas pressure. Try anything. And slowly, painfully, they made progress. The infantry version of the Krummlauf, dubbed the I variant, was 14 inches long and featured a 30-degree bend to the barrel. And its configuration began with a 4-inch straight barrel, followed by a 5.5-inch curved section and finished with another 4.5-inch straight part. This design worked. It's not perfectly, not for long, but it worked. A bullet fired from this barrel would exit at a 30-degree angle to the shooter's line of sight. And when combined with a small mirror sight mounted on top, the soldier could aim, see where the bullet would go, and fire all without exposing his head or body to the enemy. The variant used by infantrymen included a mirror that allowed the operator to see exactly where and what they were aiming at without compromising their position. Think about how revolutionary that was for its time. Today we have digital cameras, night vision, drone feeds, all sorts of technology that let soldiers see without being seen. But in 1944, all they had was a piece of curved steel and a small mirror. And with just those two things, they built something that pointed the way toward the future of urban combat. As stated by the Armory Life, using the curved barrel, a German gunner would be at least 20 centimeters below the edge of his foxhole or whatever cover he was using. 20 centimeters, less than the length of a school ruler. That was the difference between exposing your face to a sniper and staying completely safe. In the meat grinder of urban combat, that tiny margin was the difference between going home to your family and being buried in a foreign city. But here is what almost nobody talks about. There was not just one Krummlauf, there were many. And each one was designed for a very different, very specific, and very terrifying purpose. In the next section, we are going to look at the whole family of these curved, barreled weapons, including one version that could fire almost completely backwards. Yes, you read that correctly, backwards. If you thought a 30-degree bent barrel was strange, wait until you hear about the rest of the Krummlauf family, because the German engineers, once they proved the basic idea worked, went absolutely wild with variations. It was produced in several variants, an I version for infantry use, a P version for use in tanks to cover the dead areas in the close range around the tank and defend against assaulting infantry. Versions with 30-degree, 45-degree, 60-degree, and 90-degree bends, a version for the STG-44 and one for the MG-42, but only the 30-degree I version for the STG-44 was produced in many numbers. Let me repeat that for you. 90-degree bend. A 90-degree bend means the bullet exits the rifle at a perfect right angle to the shooter. Imagine holding a rifle pointing forwards, and the bullet flies out sideways to your left or right. That is a 90-degree Krummlauf. It sounds impossible, but the Germans actually built it, and they built it for one reason: tanks. As for the numbers made, 500 units of the tank mount 90-degree Versatz P were reported made and delivered by Rheinmetall Borzig. 500 of these things were actually delivered to the German army, not prototypes, not lab curiosities. Real, deployable 90-degree bent barrels intended to be mounted on real tanks and fired at real enemy soldiers. The idea was simple and terrifying. A tank crewman would poke this weapon out of a small hatch, and without exposing any part of his body, he could sweep bullets in a full arc around the tank. Any enemy soldier trying to climb onto the vehicle would be gunned down before he even knew where the shots were coming from. The idea was, the crew could extend the curved barrel out of the tank and spray enemy soldiers on their vehicle with fire without exposing themselves. It was, in theory, a game-changing anti-infantry weapon. The tank was no longer helpless against close combat troops, could defend itself in 360 degrees without a single crewman ever showing his face. But here's the problem. And this is where the story starts to turn from a wonder weapon fairy tale into a very human tale of desperation. The technology, as clever as it was, kept running into brutal, unforgiving physics. Bullets do not like being bent. When a high-velocity rifle round hits a curve in the barrel, it wants to keep going straight. It slams into the inside of the curved steel with tremendous force. This wears the barrel out fast. Very, very fast. Even after initial technical problems were addressed, the attachment only had a life of a couple of hundred rounds. Bullets often broke up in the device, and it was unlikely to achieve a hit on a target beyond 100 meters. A couple of hundred rounds, 200, maybe 300 bullets, and the barrel was scrap metal. For comparison, a normal rifle barrel can fire tens of thousands of rounds before it needs replacing. So this beautiful, clever, ingenious invention was chewing itself apart every time it was used. And the bullets themselves? They often shattered inside the curve, coming out as fragments instead of clean projectiles. Accuracy at any real distance was, to put it plainly, awful. But here's the fascinating twist. That very same weakness became a strange kind of strength in close-quarters combat. These were great disadvantages in open terrain, but less so in urban, close-quarters fighting. When the bullet disintegration increased, hit probability and lethality, read that carefully, because the bullets broke apart in the barrel, they came out as a spray of small deadly fragments, almost like a shotgun blast. In a tight alleyway, a doorway, or a trench, this was actually more dangerous than a single clean bullet. You did not need to aim perfectly. The weapon aimed itself in a way. To help the soldier make the most of this strange behavior, the engineers built a very clever sighting system. The Krummlauf barrel arrangement used a special 1.5x optical sighting device with a 12-degree field of vision, mounted directly on top of the barrel that allowed the firer to sight down the barrel at an angle using the front sight. And the last and final version, Variant V, had 2 rows of 5 vent holes on the top rear portion of the barrel, which was intended to help bleed off excess gas to prevent bursting of the barrel as the bullet rounded the curve, and this required a triangular-shaped deflecting wedge be mounted on top of the barrel directly below the optical sighting device to deflect the hot gases away from the view of the firer. Those vent holes are one of the most fascinating engineering details of the whole project. When a bullet enters a curved barrel, hot gas builds up behind it. In a straight barrel, that gas just pushes the bullet out the front and dissipates. But in a curved barrel, the gas presses sideways against the metal, threatening to explode the whole tube. So the German engineers drilled 10 small holes in the top of the barrel to let the pressure escape. Without those holes, the Krummlauf simply blew apart in the shooter's hands. With them, it survived long enough to be useful. Sometimes, the optical sight was another marvel. Small periscope-like device sat on top of the barrel, angled to look in the same direction the bullets were flying. The shooter looked into it, saw a magnified image of his target, and fired. His head stayed safely behind the wall. His body stayed safely behind the corner. Only the curved steel tube ever peeked over the edge. It was, for its time, science fiction made real. Sighting technology was so important that the Zeiss company was pulled in to help. Zeiss was, and still is, one of the most respected optics manufacturers in the world. Approximately 1,500 sights for the tank device had reportedly been made by Zeiss by the end of January 1945. And German plans were to equip every infantryman armed with the STG-44 with the 30-degree variant of the Krummlauf. Every single one. That was the goal. Every STG-44 in the German army was supposed to get a bent barrel. It was going to be a standard issue. That is how much faith the German High Command had in this weapon in the final months of the war. But faith, as we are about to see, was not enough. In the next part of this story, we are going to walk into the real battles where the Krummlauf was actually used. We are going to see what happened when this desperate wonder weapon met the cold reality of a losing war. And we are going to find out why the American soldiers who first captured one had a very different opinion from the German officers who ordered thousands of them. By the winter of 1944, the first Krummlauf rifles were making their way to the front lines. Not thousands of them, not the 20,000 that had been ordered. Just a small trickle of hand-assembled units produced in factories that were being bombed almost every night by Allied aircraft. The workers who built these rifles often had to hide in basements when the sirens went off. The steel came from smelters running on the last scraps of coal. The optics were assembled by candlelight when the electricity failed. Every single Krummlauf that reached the front was, in a way, a small miracle of German industrial stubbornness. The Krummlauf was tested extensively and saw limited fielding in 1944-45, particularly with panzer divisions on the Eastern Front. And German reports note mixed results. Tankers appreciated the protection it offered, but complained about jamming, overheating, and unreliability after extended fire, and infantry mostly saw it as a curiosity, with some using it experimentally in urban ruins during the Battle of Berlin. That is the honest, boring, unromantic truth. The tank crews who used it liked the idea. They liked the concept. They hated how often the thing failed on them. In the middle of a fight, with Soviet infantry crawling all over their turret, the last thing they needed was a rifle that jammed after 50 shots. The infantry, on the other hand, mostly saw the Krummlauf as a strange gadget, a curiosity, something to try out once and then leave in the truck. is only in the last desperate defense of Berlin. When German soldiers were fighting from window to window in the ruins of their own capital, did the Krummlauf actually get used in significant numbers by regular foot soldiers? And even then, it was more of an experiment than a proper combat weapon. Now this is where I have to stop and be very honest with you, because a lot of videos on this topic exaggerate wildly. You will see thumbnails claiming that the Krummlauf killed hundreds of Allied soldiers, or that it single-handedly turned battles around. That is not true. There is no verified historical record of the Krummlauf being used to achieve any famous, dramatic combat victory. It was too rare, it was too unreliable, and it arrived too late. What actually happened was much smaller, and in some ways more human. German soldiers in ruined buildings used these bent rifles to survive just a little longer, to hold a street corner for a few more hours, to make Soviet or American troops pay a slightly higher price for every meter of ground they took. It was not a wonder weapon, it was a survival tool. And in the final weeks of the war, survival was all anyone had left. There are reports of a few weapons being used in the battle for Berlin, and the Soviets were sufficiently impressed to trial a curved barrel version of the PPSHK submachine gun, and later the RP series as well. That is a fascinating detail. The Soviets, the very enemy the Krummlauf was designed to defeat, were so intrigued by what they saw that they picked up the idea and tried to build their own version. Even a failed wonder weapon can be a successful idea. And the concept of shooting around corners, once it was proven possible, refused to die. When American troops began overrunning German positions in early 1945, they started finding these strange, bent rifles lying in trenches and abandoned bunkers. Their first reaction was almost universal. They laughed. These were really an enigma to the U.S. troops, with most believing they were a joke. Imagine you were an American infantryman in 1945. You have been fighting your way across Europe for months. You've seen every type of German weapon there is. And then one day you walk into a bunker and you find a rifle with a barrel that curves like a banana. What would you think? Most of them thought it was a prank, a joke, something a German soldier had bent by accident and left behind. But when the intelligence officers arrived, they took the Krummlauf very seriously indeed. While most U.S. ordnance reports of the era are highly critical of the STG-44, there was a great deal of American interest in the curious curved barrel attachment. This is a really important detail that gets missed in a lot of pop history videos. The Americans dismissed the main rifle, the STG-44 itself, as a rough, ugly, poorly finished weapon, but the curved barrel that fascinated them. They shipped examples back to the United States. They interrogated German officers about how it worked. Test firing was conducted by Captain P.B. Sharp at Headquarters Communications Zone and by interrogation of German Major Fred Hartmann, who was formerly with the German Ministry of Armament, Division of Infantry Units in Berlin, supervising research on small arms developments in Berlin, Kummersdorf, and the big proving ground at Hillersleben. Major Hartmann sat down with American officers and explained the whole program. He told them about the failed prototypes. He told them about the vent holes. Told them about the mirror sights. He told them everything. American engineers listened carefully, took notes, and filed those notes away in classified archives for decades. Why? Because even though the Krummlauf had failed as a wartime weapon, the idea behind it had not failed at all. The idea was brilliant. The execution was just too primitive for its time. Smart military minds understood that if the technology ever caught up, this concept could come back in a big way. In fact, it did. And when it came back, it changed the way modern armies fight in cities forever. But that is a story for the final part of this video. Before we get there, let me leave you with one number that puts everything into perspective. The Krummlauf was a failure, in part because the barrel quickly wore out. But more fundamentally because it was unrealistic to expect that such a minor gimmick, even 100 of them, could help turn the tide of the war in favor of Germany. Even 100 of them is the honest truth, no matter how clever the invention. No single gadget was going to save Nazi Germany from the millions of soldiers closing in on Berlin. But that does not mean the invention was worthless. Because as we are about to see, the Krummlauf was 50 years ahead of its time. So the war ended, Germany surrendered, Berlin fell. And the Krummlauf, this strange, twisted, brilliant, flawed weapon, quietly disappeared from history. Most of the rifles were destroyed, some were captured, a tiny handful survived. A few Krummlauf barrels exist in museums and private collections, and the best preserved examples are in the Bundeswehr Military History Museum in Dresden, Germany, the National Firearms Center in Leeds in the United Kingdom, part of the Royal Armories, and the United States Army Ordnance Museum, though access varies due to relocations, and collectors regard these as ultra-rare war curios, and when one comes up for sale, usually demilled or destroyed. The price can exceed $25,000 just for the Krummlauf attachment. $25,000 for just the attachment. It's not the rifle, just the curved piece of steel. That is how rare these things are today. And a complete SDG-44 fitted with an original Krummlauf can sell at auction for prices that would make your eyes water. Bidding was slated for $65,000 to $95,000 on one particular example. Almost $100,000 for a rifle that most people, 80 years ago, thought was a joke. But here is the part of the story that gives me goosebumps. The Krummlauf was not the end of the idea, it was the beginning. Although the United States and Soviet Union scooped up a variety of German wonder weapons after the war, the Krummlauf was not one of them, and the concept went away for the next 50 years. For 50 years, nobody built anything like it. The technology sat quietly in classified files, waiting. Then, in the early 2000s, a group of Israeli engineers looked at the challenges of modern urban warfare. The same challenges German engineers had faced in Stalingrad and Berlin, and they had an idea. What if we took the Krummlauf concept and updated it with digital cameras and video screens? Corner shot has many of the same applications as the Krummlauf, including use by vehicle crews against enemy troops outside the vehicle they are riding in. The corner shot rifle was born, and unlike its bent-barreled ancestor, this modern version actually works reliably. It has been used by SWAT teams, counterterrorism units, and special forces around the world. The Krummlauf concept, allowing the soldier to engage around cover while remaining hidden, has now been delivered by devices such as the corner shot, as well as sighting systems where an image from a rifle held around cover is projected to a head-mounted display. So in a very real way, every single soldier today who uses a corner shooting device, every SWAT officer who peeks around a doorway with a camera-equipped weapon is walking in the footsteps of those desperate German engineers in 1943. The idea did not die with the Third Reich. It just went to sleep for half a century, waiting for the world to catch up. And that is what makes the Krummlauf story so fascinating to me. It is not a story about a superweapon. It is not a story about a battlefield miracle. It is a story about human beings looking at an impossible problem. How do you shoot at an enemy you cannot see without exposing yourself to death and refusing to accept that the problem could not be solved? The Germans who worked on this project were, in many cases, drafted into serving a horrific regime. But the technical curiosity, the engineering creativity, the willingness to try something that everyone else said was impossible, that is universally human. And it is the reason we still study this weapon today. So what should we make of the Krummlauf? Was it a failure? Yes, as a wartime weapon, it absolutely was. Was it a success? Also yes. As an idea, as a proof of concept, as a stepping stone to modern urban combat technology, it succeeded beyond anything its designers could have imagined. The men who built it never lived to see the corner shot. They never got to see modern soldiers using descendants of their idea to save lives instead of taking them. But their work, their strange, bent, mocked, laughed at work, quietly changed the future. And now, my friend, I want to hear from you. Because this story raises some big questions, and I genuinely want to know what you think. Drop your answers in the comments below. I read every single one, and the best comments will get pinned to the top. Question 1. If you had been a German infantryman in 1945, handed one of these bent-barreled rifles, would you have trusted it in combat? Or would you have thrown it away and picked up a normal weapon? Be honest with yourself. Would you bet your life on a gun that broke every rule you had ever been taught about how guns work? Question 2. Do you think the Krummlauf should be remembered as a failure or as a success? On one hand, it did not change the war. On the other hand, it invented an entire category of weapons that we still use today. Where do you draw the line between failure and innovation? Question 3. And this is the one I really want your opinion on. The Krummlauf was invented by a regime that committed some of the worst crimes in human history. but the idea behind it is now used by police, counterterrorism teams, and soldiers all over the world to save lives. Is it right to use technology born from evil for good purposes? Or should we reject inventions based on where they came from? I have my own answer to this, but I want to hear yours first. Let me know in the comments. Hit that like button if you learned something new today. Subscribe to WW2 Hero Cipher if you want more forgotten stories from the Second World War, the ones the history books skipped over. And share this video with one friend who thinks they know everything about World War II. I promise you, they've never heard this story told quite like this. Until next time, keep your eyes open, keep asking questions, and remember that history is full of secrets still waiting to be uncovered. This has been WW2 Hero Cipher, and I will see you in the next mystery.